I'm Mike Graham, and this is Putin's War, a weekly look at what's going on in Ukraine, how it's being viewed around the world, and what's happening in Russia. I'm joined as ever by Hugh Andree, our military advisor. Hugh, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
I've been hearing a lot about dirty bombs today.
Yes.
But you'll tell us about what's been happening this week and what we should be looking to investigate.
Dirty bombs, also known as false flag operations, effectively it's good use of propaganda coming out of Moscow. They were talking about certain infrastructure positions in Ukraine, like the Kharkova Dam in particular, and how they believed that the Ukrainians themselves were going to explode a device in order to damage their own infrastructure, thus blaming it on Russia.
Yeah.
Well, it's absolutely ridiculous. There's no proof whatsoever. But we've seen it before from the Russians, and as I said in previous episodes, their use of propaganda is fairly blunt and it's rather obvious. We have seen similar false flag operations both in Syria and Chechnya. But what's more worrying is the fact that they tend to use it in order to justify a reaction.
Something else, yeah.
Yeah. So they would work on the basis that they need to prepare, and often it's seen as a preliminary opportunity to escalate. That said, none of the Western US intelligence sources have seen any proof of escalation in Moscow, but certainly for sure we need to watch this space.
Yeah, because obviously since the blowing up of the pipeline and the blowing up of the bridge in Crimea, there's been all sorts of allegations made as to who could have done it. Nobody's really sure, still, I don't think, who blew up the pipeline, are we?
No, a finger hasn't been pointed yet, although I do understand it was 50 metres that was blown up. So that's a lot of pipeline, and it was clearly those IED experts, ordnance experts who've been down via submarine have confirmed that it was, obviously explosive was used, but no one yet is taking responsibility.
So it's obviously somebody that knew what they were doing there, presumably.
I can't imagine it was the Americans as stated,
No.
etc. I think what's probably what's worrying the Russians is that in Kherson at the moment, they're building up. The Ukrainians are building up their troops as part of their counter-offensive. Moscow have claimed that they're withdrawing troops. It's actually quite the opposite. There is now proof from numerous sources, both in Ukraine and in the West, that they're digging in.
Yeah.
They're putting defences in, and they're actually trying to move the inhabitants of Kherson out. I'm not sure that's for their own protection. Probably more that should the Russians lose Kherson, then they'll be able to deny, and there won't, it's a face-saving exercise.
So there's a lot of this seemingly shadowy stuff going on at the moment from the Russians' point of view as well, right? Did the West ever involve themselves in this kind of stuff, this kind of, shadow operation, this kind of, what they could black ops, I suppose, and that's what we know it as, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, all nations use what's called PSYOPs, psychological operations, of course. Whether we use them, every nation uses them, but we don't engage in terrorist operations, and effectively that's what this is. I know the Russians would be very worried about the Kharkova hydroelectric power plant being blown up. There is a dam that obviously drives power through the Kharkova Dam. If that was blown up, that would cut off all water supplies to the Crimea.
Right.
Thousands of people would be flooded, including Kherson. And the Crimean Canal would be literally emptied overnight. So it could be that, they're obviously concerned about that. But at the moment, I think all eyes are on the Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kherson.
Yeah. Also, this week we heard from our own government, obviously we've got a new Prime Minister, and who was welcomed, I think, by President Zelensky, and I think they've had a conversation already, only one day into Rishi Sunak's time. But there was warnings about the energy supplies in Ukraine, and people shouldn't go back. Some of the refugees who might go back shouldn't go back. So is there an energy sort of crisis worse than most, if you like, in Ukraine?
Well, I think Zelensky himself has stated that they've lost a third of their power generating plants.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why, we know that Ben Wallace went to Washington, and part of that discussion would be how could they protect infrastructure, such as the power plants, the electric generating plants, the dams, supply lines, how can they protect those from Russian attacks by obviously offering up air defence systems to counteract the drones, etc.
I was going to say, we talked a lot about the drones the other week. Has that kind of abated somewhat?
Zelensky said on Saturday that they'd taken out 36 drones, but I think what became very apparent after our discussion last week was the requirement for the West, for the US, for Ukrainian allies to keep supplying kit and equipment to the Ukrainian forces with winter coming. I've got a statement here from a conscript who was a Russian conscript. He got recruited in the Stavropol region of southern Russia. And he said the following: "We've been issued with paintball masks, children's gloves, and rubber boots." And he said on camera, "They think we will be wandering around like Star Wars, wearing this bull SH-1T with no aim and no goal." And I think that really just backs up the challenge that Vladimir Putin is having, in that he has massively undertrained troops, resources are running low, and some of these conscripts are even claiming that they're having to buy their own food. So he is on the back foot. And so the use of this false flag operation, again, it's really sort of, it tends to point that he's taking desperate measures now. And I think if we support Ukraine, we can continue to give them the kit and equipment, then an offensive during the winter to retake Kherson would be a significant loss to him.
And as far as the amounts of money that have been already promised, I think 2 billion was what was promised, wasn't it, to Ukraine most recently. The difficulty for this government, as a new government supposedly trying to save money, is they can't really go back on any of that, can they?
Not really, and I don't think they would. And I think, as a nation, we quite rightly supported Ukraine. My understanding is that at the moment, for example, we're even moving we have 60 Challenger 2 tanks, correct, being moved from effectively a storage hub to the Sennelager training ground in Germany, which I know extremely well, in order to have them in a state of operational readiness. So we're doing numerous things as a nation to keep supporting them, as we should do. And I think we also need to remember that we should be doing that on a humanitarian perspective as well.
We've spoken as well before about the state of different parts of the country, and there are clearly some parts of the country not as badly hit as others. But are there any, I mean, I know this is probably a bit of a naive question to ask, but are there any kind of safe havens, if you like, in Ukraine for people to where they are living relatively trouble-free?
I believe on the west near the Polish border is going to be probably the safest area. But whether it's Kiev, in the Donetsk, the south, the east, none of them are out of reach.
They're all in the firing line.
They're all in the firing line. And we mentioned in Belarus and the support that they're giving Russia. If Belarus and their leadership could be persuaded to tone it down a little bit again, that would make it a bit safer. But at the moment, if you're in a war zone with long-range tactical missiles, etc., you're not really safe anyway.
Okay. And so this week, what do you think we're going to see?
I think it's all about looking at Kherson. I think with winter approaching, if we can continue to supply the Ukrainian forces with the kit and equipment that they need for the winter, that will naturally then keep their morale up I think President Zelensky's got to focus at looking at taking back that city. It was one of the first cities taken and annexed by Putin, and I think if he manages to do that, Putin's going to have some real questions being asked of him back in Moscow.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Hugh there giving us the lowdown on what's been happening this week. We'll be back with more on Putin's war here on talkTV with me, Mike Graham, and Hugh Andree next week.